Good morning, folks, and welcome to the workshop of Armitage Leather. So leather selection. What leather are we going to use for this item? The difficulty that we are getting into here is if you are watching this in the UK and you are buying the leather that is available to me, then you're going to be fine. But what if you're looking for this leather in Europe? Well, you've got Van Dyke leather suppliers in Holland, stocks Lamport from Metropolitan Leather. I'm not entirely sure if anybody in the US is stocking it at the moment, but that would be a really good idea if somebody wants to pick that up. And that's it. That's your choices, really. So if you're in Australia or if you're in South America or anywhere else that doesn't have easy access, what leather do you need to be looking for? Have you got the perfect leather sitting on your shelf? So rather than talking about what is and isn't the perfect leather, what I will do is catalogue what I'm going to use. It's shoulder. It's called case shoulder. It's not a term that's used frequently anymore, but that's a dry, tan, dye-through leather. It's not greasy, it has no pull-up oil, and it's split down to 1.5 millimeters thick. It's firm. It holds its own substance. It would be classed as a medium to firm handle or hand. But this is the secret. It's about the techniques that we are going to apply to our leather. If your leather resists these techniques, it will work. What do I mean by that? Here I have two pieces of leather. This is the 1.5 millimeter Lamport shoulder in brown, and this is 1 millimeter thick goat. So we can get very enthusiastic about, oh, I'm going to make it out of thin leather, it wants to be soft, it wants to be malleable. That's absolutely fine, okay, if the leather resists the technique. So here's an example. We're going to apply a couple of techniques to the edges of this leather. The first is creasing. So we'll try the goat first, and we can see that the goat is puckering. So as a result, it's not resisting the technique. We can hold it down, but it's running away from the tool. We come over to the 1.5 millimeter shoulder, we can do that all day long. It does not move. It resists the technique. We then look at beveling. We can't even get it started. You can see how the leather is just running away from that technique. If we can't apply that technique to the leather, and these are the techniques we want to apply, it's the wrong leather. If we start looking at skiving, that's not going to skive well at all. You're fighting against it. The leather is working against you. If we come to the 1.5 millimeter shoulder, that bevels all day long. This leather has a firm handle. I'm holding this up under its own weight. They are of similar length. I hold this up. It relaxes at the point I'm holding it. It's too soft, it is too supple. So one of the worst things that we can do is go to our bag of scraps that we got for a £5 off eBay and go, I'm going to make it out of that. And it doesn't work. And you're sat at your bench with your head in your hands going, I've got it wrong. Because we love to take ownership when something goes wrong. It must be me. So therefore I've done something wrong. And we try and adjust. But the truth is, it's the material that's letting us down. If it's not resisting something simple like a crease or a bevel, it's not going to resist skiving, it's not going to resist dressing and slicking down, and it's going to make your stitching look funny. So you can be reasonably adept with a skill set, but what you've produced is abhorrent because the material is just simply not working for you. It's like trying to build a brick wall with the bottom course made out of marshmallows. Right shape, right size, right colour will not support anything. So rather than say to you, you have got to use Lamport from Metropolitan Leather here in the UK, for those in the UK or Europe because of Van Dyke Leather Supplies, that's fine. But if you're outside of that area for either of those, then you've got to choose a leather that's suitable for you. And find a leather that resists the techniques that we need to apply. Hole marking, adding a crease line. The two really that are going to tell you are your crease and your bevel. If it takes a crease well, if it takes a bevel well, the chances are it's going to take skiving and dressing well, and when it's stitched it will look good. Do not be enthusiastic about going for soft, malleable leather. Your skill set has to be so much higher to manage a problematic leather. You have to have absolute confidence in your skill set that if something goes wrong, it's not you. So your management of what goes wrong with that leather, or management of that leather, needs to be much higher. So going off that proviso of having a leather that resists the techniques that we want to apply to the item, what I'm going to use is a piece of 1.5mm thick Lamport shoulder from Metropolitan. Now this is what they call naked. It is finished, but it's not coloured. We can see how the leather has picked up a little bit of a suntan. For this, that's not going to matter. It's going to continue with use to darken with age. But this is a natural colour that has just been finished, ready for use. This is not russet. So russet would not be finished. You would need to finish russet after or before cutting out. So what I'm going to do here is exactly as you've seen me do with the templates. I'm creating a common edge. This is a consistent line that I can take most of my measurements from. Now I know I want to work to 71mm. That's what my figures say. So I can set my rule stop to 71 and work along with that number. However, when I cut my template, I might have set the rule stop not to 71 but 70.89. I may have cut and varied that cut. So to alleviate any variations that may appear, I am simply going to put my rule stop against my template, and I'm going to adjust until the top of the rule is perfectly flush with the top of the template. This means this measurement is the same side as this card. Even if that doesn't work, it does work out, to be fair, to be 71, but even if that doesn't work out to be 71, we have calculated all of the information that we need on this piece of card at that size. So it's the size of the card that's more important than what we get written down on a piece of paper. So this piece of leather is big enough for me to get all four pieces out of. I have a consistent number running through all of my pieces. Remember, that's why we wrote out our parts list. And that consistent number is 104mm. That's the width of our item. If I now cut a strip at 104mm, and that strip is big enough to get all four pieces out of, then all of my pieces are going to be consistently the same size. That's really important. So if we have that opportunity to do so, then we will do so. Now, I can simply go to my rule and I can set that to 104mm and continue. But I could be introducing errors that I'm not aware of. At this moment in time, we set the rule stop to 104 to cut our piece of card, but we may have set the rule to 103.89 or 104.24, something like that. And the truth is, certainly with my eyes, we can introduce an element of variation, and that element of variation can make the leather a different size to the template. So a really good idea, if we are able, is to put the template back over the rule. And what I'm looking for when I do this is the rule and the template being perfectly flush at the top. Now, bearing in mind both the templates that I'm using came from the same piece of card. So all 4 pieces of leather that I want to use, or all 4 pieces, want to come from the same piece of leather. So I'm just micro adjusting at the moment. I now have my rule perfectly aligned with this piece of card. Both the card and the rule are flush at the top. I can get my other template, do the same thing. We can turn it over, have a look. That looks good. As does that. If I hold it flat, the edge disappears. If I tilt it up, we can begin to see the edge. Hold it flat, and that is beautiful. So that does look to be 104, looks to be a slightly shy 104, but the most important thing here is we've got this piece of card, whatever measurement it is. We've done all of our working out on this piece of card, and it works. If we change the dimensions now, it might not work, so we don't want to change the dimensions. Yes, we have a number written down, but in checking your template with your measurement, we know the piece of leather we're getting is going to be the same size. That's going to make consistency appear. What I can then do, now I have that figure locked in, is bring my common edge to the edge of the bench, settle my rule in position, and I'm going to have 4 marks on this piece of leather. What I'm looking for here is all 4 of those marks touching my rule. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time lining up, and I can see that all 4 of those marks sit on the top of that rule beautifully. Now, I'm not inclined to go to a scratch rule to do this. Normally I'd go straight to the knife, but I'm just going to run a scratch all through, and it's as if those marks disappear. So I have a good position for my rule. I can then now commit to a cut. Beautiful. I have a parallel piece. How can I check this? I can't run a center line down it. We can do something as simple as this. Without stressing the leather, we can take one piece to the other end and line them up and have a look. And we can see that this end is the same as this end. That's parallel. We're happy with that. So what I can do now is square off one end. And I'm going to get rid of that scratch at the end there. And I'm going to have the very lightly paler section for my bodies. So I'm doing my bottom end cut first. If you don't know what that is, it's on the channel. Now, I'm ready to move down. I know this is the wrong end, but I can always just nibble that corner to go belt and braces, just on the off chance I get confused. Let's face it, I'm old, I'm grey, I probably get confused a lot. When cutting out these pieces, it's always a good idea to cut the larger pieces first. Because if we make a mistake, that can become a smaller piece. But if we do this, then this, then this, and this, and make a cock up, if we haven't got enough left over, we've got nowhere to go. So it's good practice to cut your larger pieces first. If you're making a bag and you've got a fresh hide, remember to cut the straps first, because it's very easy to whittle down a hide to make the bag, only to realise I've not got enough length left to cut my straps from. So in doing your first straight edge, cut your straps first, then move on to the body of your bag, just if you're a bag maker. So with that in mind, I know the height of this is 71. We do what we did before. I can either set this to 71 and run the risk. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to set my template onto my rule, and I'm going to lock it to match the rule. So again, I'm looking for that beautiful flush edge between the top of the rule and the top of the template. Turn it over, and again, that disappears when we flatten it off. That's a good measurement. So I can now bring this edge to the edge of the board and mark in twice. Now normally, we'd consider doing that 3 times at least. However, 2 is sufficient in this instance because my third reference point is going to be my square. This means I can use the rule again, set the edge of my leather up against the rule, bring the square into play. We've measured from this side, so therefore we're going to cut from this side. And I can bring my square to those 2 lines. Now, if one of them is wrong, it will show itself here. They are correct. That means with the 2 lines and the right angle as a reference point, I have a perfect right angle and the correct measurement. Beautiful. So that's one body taken care of. Rinse and repeat. Back to the edge of the board. Mark. Mark. I've measured from this side, I'm cutting from this side. If we do this, we may move where we cut against where we want to cut, and we change the size of that piece of leather. And if we do that, then all of a sudden it doesn't fit against the other piece. That's the 2 bodies done. We know this is rocking in at 51, but again, we're going to use the template to set the rule, not the numbers. Lock off and check. Beautiful. Bring it to the edge of the board. Mark right, mark left. Bring it back into the board, up against the rule, bring the square into play, line up, those 2 meet perfectly, and cut. That first scribe makes those lines disappear. That's exactly what we are looking for. So that's the first pocket done. And I will do the same for the second pocket. Whenever we make something, we are always trying to find some way of confirming what we've just done is correct. Because if we don't and we make a mistake, all we are doing is cascading towards a huge error. So if our pieces aren't square, if our pieces aren't the correct size, and we just move forward with all of this, we won't know until we stitch it together. And then all of a sudden, it buckles, it twists, it doesn't fit, we've got too many holes in one place and not enough in another, and it demonstrates itself in a poorly made item. We may think, nobody's going to see that, but people do see it. Even to the untrained eye. They won't necessarily know what they're seeing, but they will see that something's not quite right. So if we can catch these errors early, because there will be errors, it does happen, and it may be a case that we get to a point where we stitch it together and go, oh no, it doesn't fit. So we've wasted all the time that we're about to spend on creasing and dressing and cutting the corners, stitch marking and stitching to find an error. But if we can find that error now, it's just a case of cutting another piece or two if that's the problem. So this is a really nice way of confirming the pieces we're working with are going to work for us. I use a pair of corner jigs. Now these are actually for box making, but they work really well for this because they're thick. And what I can do, and a couple of engineer squares, as long as they're a little thicker, will work exactly the same. And all we're going to do is put one square on each corner, put the template over the top, and we're going to press. What I'm looking for here is my two pieces, my template and my leather, matching. So the first thing that I'm looking for the template on top is that the template is not smaller than the leather, because if it is, when I do this, it'll move, and it doesn't. So I'm happy that the leather is not bigger than the template. I then turn it over and do it the other way around. Now I'm doing exactly the same thing to find out if actually the leather is a little bit smaller than the template, and I'm going to move it around, and it doesn't. So I'm happy with that. That fits. I can then do the same with my next piece. Squish it down. That doesn't move. Do it the other way around. That doesn't move. And then we go to our little pieces. Template first. Nope. Nope. Last one. If there's a problem, it will demonstrate itself here. Nope. So, these pieces are the same size. So if I put it around there, I can flatten that off. So the top sits beautifully flush. The edges sit beautifully flush. If the leather is bigger, then when we set up, we may have a piece of leather sticking out the side. And what we may find is, well, we'll do these holes up against the edge, but then we'll move these, then our bottom row don't fit, we end up with a long stitch. If our leather is smaller than the template, and we do the same thing, so we put it up against this edge, we mark these holes, which are fine, but because the leather is shrinking under the template, it's too short, these holes end up too close to the leather. If we move and adjust that, then the problem transfers down here where we have a short stitch. So ensuring that our pieces are the right size before we move forward prevent all of those problems. So again, we can do this visually, run our finger over the top, that is beautiful. Do the same on the side, that is beautiful. So we have cut our pieces well, which means we can trust them. This means we can now use the template to transfer this information through to the leather. So now we know the leather is the same size as the template, we can trust putting the template over the leather. Now, all we're going to do on the large pieces for the time being is cut the corners. We are not going to do any marks. So all I'm going to do is settle onto the template, again making sure I'm between the two pencil lines, and press. Give it a little bit of a thump, move it away, and there's my cut. And I'm going to do the same on each corner. And I'm going to do that for both pieces. Both pieces have their corners cut. Again, they look good, but we will run our finger round them. If we have any areas that are slightly high, we can just lightly run some sandpaper over them. Now for the pockets, we're going to do exactly the same, so we'll swap the templates over. But what we're going to do first is we are only going to start off by cutting the bottom corners. Do the same on the opposite corner. Let me quickly do the other one. And there we go, all done. At no point have we got any catches, have we got any cuts. We have been able to maintain a reasonable level of accuracy in doing this. Now the next thing that I'd like to do is run a stitch line around the outside, but before I do so, I'm going to check to make sure if I have any high points. And I'm just going to run a bit of sandpaper down the edges, and the idea behind this is if we have even the slightest little bit of variation on the edge of our leather, when we run a tool round the edge of that leather, it can transfer to the mark and it either comes across as a judder or a jump. And if we can avoid that, we will do so. And this is a really good way to ensure we avoid that, just by a little bit of maintenance first. Beautiful. Whilst I've got the block out, I'm going to do the same to these two pieces as well. There we are. This means I can now take this tool and run this lightly around the edge of the leather. What I will highlight at this moment in time is the colour of leather that I'm using doesn't really matter. I'm using a lighter colour because all the techniques that I'm applying to the leather show up much clearer on camera. If I go for a darker leather, then it's a lot harder to see what's being done. So if you're looking at this thinking, Nige, that's lovely, but I don't like the colour, it's not important. What is important is you can see what's being done. Now I have put those lines on the leather as a guide to help me confirm the next bit. So what I'm going to do is bring the small template back into play, and I'm going to square off like so. What I will do then is bring the two tooth out, and I'm going to mark through the template into the leather. But I'm not going to mark every single hole. I'm going to mark the beginning of the vertical and the bottom of the vertical, because if I take my 9 tooth, I can then find out if that spans. It doesn't quite, so I'm going to mark a couple more. On the curve, I'm going to mark every hole And across the bottom, the first two, and then I'm going to go for the middle 5 because the 9-tooth iron won't span cleanly enough. And then I'm going to do the bottom 2 and the top 2. What I'm going to do when I take the template off is to look to see if those marks that I've just made adhere to the line that I drew. And they do. But if you've put the tool in and you've lent it slightly, they won't. What we can do here, because we've only very, very lightly marked the leather, is if we have varied from that line, we can bring it back to the line. So we can bring the pad into play. I'm not necessarily going to punch through, but I'm going to line up with the holes that I've made, and they fit on the line beautifully. And then I'm going to commit. I am going through the leather a little, so I am going to use a pulling block, and we can see that's come out beautifully. And then we need to move that down one more. Same thing. Then we can go across the bottom, start off at those first two. Now, if my holes don't quite sit on the line, I can defer to the line, so I can move them over a little to ensure that my stitching is exactly in the right position. Because when we commit with these holes, if we've marked very slightly off, in making the holes, it will get rid of those marks. But I'm fortunate here that all of my marks line up with my lines. That is the object of this game. Then I can go to the corner and I can treat them exactly the same as I did on the template. That one can come down from the top, and then these two can be dealt with as a matched pair. Like so. Do exactly the same on the opposite corner. This top one will join on at a very, very slightly different angle to the vertical line, but these bottom two, once again, will be dealt with as a matched pair. And there we go. We have beautiful hole placement. We're going to make these holes a little larger, but we're going to do it further down the line. It is a case now of rinse and repeat. Because we've gone through this process, we trust our template is the same size as our leather, therefore we can trust marking through these holes. So top two, bottom two, then all the ones at the corner, first two of the bottom straight, 5 in the middle, last two, all the ones on the corner, bottom two of the right hand vertical, top two of the right hand vertical. We will have a look to see if our holes match our lines, and again they do. This is about putting the tool in perfectly vertical. That's going to take a bit of practice, but in marking lightly we open up the opportunity for adjustment and fixing any very slight variations that we create. What we are not going to do is do this to our body pieces. we're going to make our holes in our body piece after we glue the pocket to it. This in essence, because if we made all of the holes independently in all 4 pieces, when we come to stitch, we're trying to manage all 4 pieces. Now the truth is we don't actually need to glue this together to get a good edge. The way that we're stitching it will give us a good edge, and the way that we dress it will also. But we are manipulating 4 pieces of leather, which can make things a little difficult. So to make life easier, we're going to glue each pocket to each body. This turns 4 pieces of leather into 2. And again, exactly the same with the corner. We do it the same way every single time. The top hole of our corner is dealt with from the bottom of the straight vertical, and the 2 at the bottom are dealt with as a pair. Last one. Beautiful. That matches that, and they match that as well. Our hole placement is absolutely bob on. We will make these holes proper, but we'll do it once we've glued the pocket onto the front, and we can go through all of these as one piece. So there's a few more things that we need to do before we get to that point. If I glue the pocket onto the body now, it makes dressing this top edge of the pocket and the top edge of the body a little harder. So we're going to deal with that first. In addition to that, if we were to put all 4 of our pieces together, because this leather is 1.5 millimeters thick, so when we add all 4 pieces up together, we get 6 millimeters of leather, and we have this big step going on here. And that's fine, because by the time we fill this with cards, it's going to be chunky anyway. But we may want to give consideration to thinning this edge down. It looks a little sleeker and a little better finished. We can line that piece up as well. That corner looks lovely, and we can see there, no clever cuttings needed afterwards, because all of those pieces are the correct size. So we want to bring this edge down. Normally, we'd say, well, I'll tell you what, we'll skive the back of the pocket, which is fine. And if that's a skill that you're comfortable with, move forward with it. But problems can be encountered when doing this. We can take the skive on the pocket down too much, and we can have a really thin piece of leather here. We can sometimes even go too far, and we can actually see the skive appear on the front. What this does when we stitch it together means we are stitching a very, very thin piece of leather onto our item. This is a point of failure. We have introduced that. So to avoid that but get the same result, we are not going to skive the pockets. We are going to skive the body. What this does is protects the skive. If we go down too far with our skive and we end up with a very, very thin and weak piece of leather, in actually sandwiching it between 2 other pieces of leather, we bring that strength back. Our strength has been returned by our pockets. And the fact that this body has been skived too thinly no longer matters. It's not going to fail, because that skive is just sandwiched. It isn't being stressed in any other way, because we've got external pressure from our stitching forcing this together. And it's like stitching a piece of paper onto the front of this. That piece of paper is vulnerable. But if we stitch a piece of paper right in the middle of everything, then that piece of paper becomes almost invulnerable. So we're going to transfer where we skive into the body, and we're not going to skive the pockets. We're going to get round to that in a bit. The first thing that we're going to do is looking at dressing the tops of our leather. So what I'm going to do first is crease the top of the pockets. But what I'm going to do is test the size of my crease first. There's my stitch line. And there's my crease. And I'm happy with that. Now that's a cold crease. So what I'm going to do is apply a little bit of heat to it. Now unfortunately, this particular tool is an old Dixon's and you won't find in the shops anymore. But there are lots of companies making purse creases. Wutar, Cints, Crimson Hides, or if you've got one of the electric ones, even better. At which point then I'm going to have a look and see what that looks like. And that is coming out beautifully. I'm happy with that, so that's what I'm going to go for. So we'll bring in one of the pockets. Whilst it's still got some heat, I will run that down. And that's the crease at the top of my pocket taken care of. We'll do the other one. Gorgeous. And then I'm going to bring my bodies in, and what I'm going to do is just lightly run around this corner and add a crease above where the stitching is going to sit. Taking my time, keeping the tool perpendicular to get around that corner. Same again on the opposite side. Patience is the key here. That's done, and exactly the same to the last one. Just below that line at the transition point where the curve goes into the straight is where the stitching is going to be. So it doesn't need to be any lower than that. And there we go. Beautiful. So with our crease in place, we can come back to our pockets. I'm going to run a very fine bevel along the back. This is a 0 Palo Santo, and that's how fine it is, because the fibres are bigger and further apart. That's coming off as dust. However, when we run it down the grain side, it's so fine it's inside the tool. But that's as much as we want to take off. Virtually nothing. But that's an interesting point that we're covering here. The flesh side is weaker than the grain side. This is by far the strongest side. And were we to cut a strip of this, 20mm wide, and then split it right down the middle, so we've got 3/4 of a millimetre on one side and 3/4 of a millimetre on the other, and we were to test the tensile strength of both pieces, this would be 2-3 times stronger than this, 4 times stronger. The grain side, the good side, is the strongest part of the leather, without doubt. This is why you never see me use a stitch groover, because if you put a groove for your stitching, you're taking your strength away. You're also offering a point for moisture to gather and stay and the item to rot. A groove, oh, we can actually see that one coming out now. There we go. Will work against you, not for you. There is definitely a place for it, but this is not it. So we're going to remember that strength relationship between the two edges or the two sides of the leather when we come to skive. So again, in fact we can bring this one down a little further to where the pocket's actually going to sit. And if you're not entirely sure where that is, there's nothing wrong with just putting the pocket nearby and then taking it to that point there. Let's do the same to this. When we bevel on the back, we're going to bevel just where the stitching stops, so that's at the transition point between the curve and the straight. Take that dust off the back. Bring the pocket into play. Almost the right way round. So I'm doing the top, not the bottom. Start it at the top of the pocket. And then all the way round to the other side. Back round that corner. And then again, stopping just where that pocket sits. So that's our pieces creased and beveled. So now we're going to apply some edge coat. It's your choice what solution you decide to put on your edge. A lot of people don't like edge coats because it doesn't stick. The reason it doesn't stick is perhaps they have slicked this first but not roughed it up with a piece of sandpaper to give the edge coat a key. So what we're going to do is not slick it. Less is more in this instance, especially on a pale leather. We don't want it hitting the surface. We are going to apply it to our leather. Now this is another big problem that people have, is they just put it on, or they put too much on and leave it. What we are going to do is begin the slicking process early, because this is a wet solution. Therefore the fibres are now wet, which means they're susceptible to slicking. So we're going to start that slicking process now. And in slicking using the edge coat, we are not only bonding the edge coat to the leather, so we're pushing it in a little further, but we're flattening those fibres down in preparation for the next stage, which is our slicking. Now you can over rub this. If you rub it when it's dry, you'll just lift the fibres back up and it'll go rough again. But that is already a nice looking edge, yet it hasn't been slicked down properly, but that's enough. We don't need to go overboard. We don't need to put a massive amount on there. We need to put enough to cover, and when we've got enough to cover, we rub in, starting that slicking process early. We can go back to the pot as many times as we want. Now in this instance, for this particular type of leather and this particular solution, Fibing's edge coats, a wheel will not do the job well, because all a wheel will do is sit on the surface. If the fibres are proud and upright, this edge coat plasticizes, it hardens, and as a result, once it's hard, those fibres are very difficult to slick down, so we don't get a nice shiny edge. So that's another really good reason for slicking them down as we apply the edge coat. This is actually an incredibly durable and long-lasting way to treat your edges. I've had items come back to me from 15 years ago, and the edge coat is still good. There's an awful lot on that stylus. We do not need to overdo it or belabor it. Put too much on, we also run the risk of it dripping onto our leather. That's something to be avoided. There we go. Doing it this way will also remove a huge amount of necessity for sanding. So if we get too enthusiastic with our sanding, we can actually move the lines that we've created. We are then going to let those dry. We are now going to have a look at slicking our edges with Tokonol. But what we don't want to do is apply Tokonol to a wet edge, because all we will do is spread the black around and it'll go everywhere. So we're going to take a cloth, wrap it around the finger, and we're going to slide it down the length of the pocket once and once only. We're not going to rub, because if we rub and we pick up some black on the second pass, we may put it down in the wrong place. Nothing came off, that's dry. We're going to do the same to the other pocket. That's absolutely fine. We're going to look at the tops. Absolutely fine. They are completely dry. So, nothing's coming off. We are ready for our Tokonol. We don't need much. We don't really want to saturate this. So we're going to take a bit, put it on our finger. That's probably enough to do 2 or 3 card holders. We'll get rid of some of it. We can always come back to it. And we're going to dab along. More than enough. And then we're going to move that Tokonol along the top of the leather. When we do so, what we're looking for is a slick edge. If it feels slick, then that's good coverage. We can then do all of those, because we don't necessarily need to do it straight away. Beautiful slick edge. And moving on. And we do this to all of our pieces in preparation for slicking. That's lovely. And then finally, our last body piece. And there we are. We've still got some left. We'll get rid of that. Which slicker? If we use the wrong slicker and we use too much power, it can cause the leather to mushroom and distort at the top. We definitely do not want this. So having a slicker that's had the grooves cut correctly is really important. You get these from justwood.com. I know this is correct because I designed it. A slicker is not a slicker, just a piece of wood. We can use this end, but too much power will cause us to distort the leather, and that causes a little bit of a mushroom effect. So we find the groove that fits the leather, which is the first one on this one, and we simply rub down. Now, power is not the key. Speed is. We want to keep the same piece of tool in contact with the leather, because this rubbing is generating heat and friction. The Tokonol is acting now as a lubricant, so that's stopping it getting too hot and fluffing the fibres up. And we do that until we get a nice shiny edge. On such a thin piece, it's probably difficult for me to catch the light. So I'll keep on moving it round just on the off chance that you get a glint of that. I'm not entirely sure you are, but touch is important. You feel it, and as soon as it's smooth and gorgeous, it is done. So all the edges that could not be dressed when it's stitched together have been dressed. This is creasing, beveling, edge coating, Tokonol and slicking. So the example of that is when we put the pocket onto the body, we can see that top edge is dressed. That would be very difficult to do once it's stitched together. Equally, so would this. So when we start putting our pieces together like so, We can see what needs to be dressed has been dressed, and the edges here will be dressed once everything has been stitched together. Now, we want to look at reducing this bulk down. So, what we're going to do then is not skive the pockets, we're going to skive the body. We've had the discussion about the grain side being stronger than the flesh side. So therefore our skive is going to be off the flesh side, leaving the grain side. Even if we go a little too thin because our skill set isn't on point, we can still manage to get a credible card holder out of our pieces. So we're going to be using a French skive to do this. This is a French skive. Probably one of the most versatile tools you could buy. There are so many occasions that you can use this, and it will do an incredibly effective job and save your skin at the same time. And the reason are these two little bars at the top here. So with a normal skiving knife, where we would skive like so, it's actually quite difficult to govern the depth of that, because first and foremost you're behind it and you can't see the depth because you're looking at the wrong side, and we can go too deep with it and we won't know that until it's too late. Whereas with this we can actually govern the depth by moving the tool in and out. Now I recommend a 12mm French skive. The difficulty is not everybody uses a skiving knife the same way. So if we were to look perhaps at how Palo Santo, because Palo Santo does not recommend you buying a 12, he recommends you buying a 10, but he uses it differently. And the way that Palo Santo would use it is by using the whole tool. So if we engage the whole tool like so, let's have a look and see what happens to our cut. And we can see there that we've actually taken off leather. That has worked against us, but we're going to use it a different way. So what's happening here, this is our leather. What I've just done is put one bar of the tool here and the other bar here. This means when we skive, we are skiving all the way down to the board. This piece of leather in this area here gets incredibly thin, distorts and lifts. That's why we've taken some off. So what we're going to do, and this is why the wider tool is better, is we are only going to use half the tool. That means we put a bar here and a bar here. Then when we skive, we are actually leaving leather behind because we have a step. So if I draw between these two, we can see we're leaving an amount of leather behind. This is much stronger and it doesn't lift. What we can then do is move the tool in to here if we want to extend that skive. Not drawn to scale. But then when we look at that, we realise we're taking this top piece of leather off. So we are stepping in our skive incrementally. So let's look at that in practice then. If we bring our piece of leather back and we straighten that off, we can do something like this. Because we only want to use half the tool, we can set a line on our leather. Now 6 is halfway. I've got 5 here, so I'm going to set mine at 5. Now if I set the right hand bar on the line, we can see the left hand bar and half the tool is hanging off the leather. Now, if I push down, following that line, I end up with a far more consistent skive. And this is what I've taken off, and this is what I have left. I have more leather left. Even if we go a little thin here, remember that that is being sandwiched between two other pieces of leather. And as a result, we end up with a much stronger construction because we're taking the weakness from the outside of the item and putting it in the middle. So that's exactly what I'm going to be doing to my body. Now, we're not going to do it at the front. That's the strong bit. We're going to do it to the back. We need to know where we're cutting from and where we're cutting to. So we know this is the top because it's dressed. So we can pop the pocket template back onto our body. And I can just lightly mark either side with a pen. And do the same to the other piece. This gives me a clear start and stop point. I can then take my 5mm marker. We don't need to go round the corners, we can go straight off the leather, straight onto the leather in straight cuts. But these are good guides for me to follow. And I am now all of a sudden putting myself in a position where if I do take it a little thin, I haven't ruined the item. I can go a little further. I can take a rule or a guide and I can pop it on that line. This does two things. One, it stops the tool coming into the leather, but two, it actually holds the leather flatter against the board. So what I'm going to do now is lift the handle of the tool up, so I'm pushing the blade down, and then flatten it off and skive like so. That's what I've taken off. I can then come to my edge here, do exactly the same again. I don't need to lift here. I can start off at the correct angle and then just push forward like so. Go round. It's going to change a little bit here because I'm going to start off flat, but as I get to that line, what I'm going to do is drop the handle down, which lifts the blade up so it comes up through the leather at that line. And that's my skive. Have a little high point on each corner, just settle it on that high point and take it off like so. It's not a difficult tool to use, but we can go a step further because we may look at that and go, well, that's not enough. Sometimes I want to go much further. We can come back to our last successful piece. If I now do something like this, if I put the left hand bar right in the middle of the last skive that I just did, and then line my tool up with that, what I'm doing is changing the angle. And I'm taking off the high point between the skive and the back of the leather. And we're taking off a bit more. It's not a lot, but it might be enough. If it isn't enough, we can go back and actually do it again. And we can keep going. You can actually thin down a huge piece of leather by doing this. And we can see, get rid of that fluff. And we can see our taper appear. This is a fantastic tool if you want to roll that edge over. If you want to bend this, we can make it softer. Again, on the channel, you see me use this to thin pieces of leather down. You also see me use it to do a stepped skive for piping. So I can use quite a thick piece of leather. The bag at the moment, so if you look at this is piped and it's 2.2mm thick. That leather is too thick to turn back on itself at 90 degrees to allow the piping to sit in there. So we use the French skive at the edges of the leather to thin down. That means we can have a good structured leather, but still pipe it. This is how cartridge bags are made. So there's a huge amount of versatility to a tool like this. It's underrated. I think the vast majority of what you can do with a skiving knife, you can do with this. But what you can do with this, you can't do with a skiving knife. An investment worth the money all day long. Anyway, let's get rid of that. We've skived that down. We have a look. We haven't taken a massive amount off. And truth be told, we don't need to. A little bit high there, so I can always come back and just take that little high point off there. It's not much, but it'll make a difference. We do the same here. Flatten it down. Good guide for our tool, but also keeps the leather nice and flat. When I apply the tool, I'm lifting the handle up so I can cut in at that line, and as soon as I cut in, I can flatten the tool down and push along. Turn it around, do the bottom edge. When we do the bottom edge, we keep the tool flat. Same angle all the way through. We don't vary it. Then when we do our last edge, where we're coming out of the leather at the line, we start flat, but as we get to the line, we drop the handle of the tool down. That raises the blade and it comes out where the mark is. Back to our corners. Just snuffle those off. Beautiful. We haven't made these fragile, but had we, in sandwiching it between these two, we're getting our strength back. What we can do now is have a quick look at this. We can put these two together like so. We can put these together like so. We can see our 6mm of leather at the top here. That's chunky. But if we drop it down now, line everything up, we can see actually, when we squisherize it in place, we've taken off quite a bit of meat. That's enough to be subtle. Yes, by all means, we could take a little bit off the back of this as well. We're not going to, but if we wanted to, we could. But those weak cuts are inside, so they are not vulnerable. That's cool. That's a really effective way of having the effect of the skive and tapering down, but doing it in a different place to make your life easier. Because had we ruined that, we'd have to replace it. All that hard work is gone. And we have to do our holes before we do our skives, otherwise it's not flat anymore. That has got to be worth a like, subscribe and follow. That will get you out of so much trouble, just changing where we skive and perhaps how we skive. So what we want to do now is glue a pocket to a body twice. At the moment we don't have a key on here for the glue. We don't have a key on the back because we haven't skived the back. So what we're going to do is come back to our template. We're going to have our pocket template and a body piece of leather, and we're going to line that up perfectly. But what we're going to do is move the guide out of the way, and we're going to move the template down so it's overhanging by about 1mm or so. And then we are going to mark the left and the right. We are not going to run a line down because you will see it. Here we have our two marks, but if we put this back in place, when it's stitched, it sits over the top, so we won't see that. We do exactly the same on our other body, making sure we're working at the bottom, not the top. Line it all up, move it down 1mm or so, It can be a couple of millimeters. There's our marks. We move it back up into position. Our marks are hidden. What we're going to do now is use a square to cover the good bit of leather. And just in case we slip with the sanding, we're not going to damage the leather. And we get a detail sander of our choice. These are available from Axminster, also from Crimson Hides as well. And we rough an area up. It does not need to be a massive area. And then across the bottom. Ultimately, we are not relying on the glue to hold our piece together. We are relying on the stitching. So this is just a temporary bond to keep everything in place and make stitching easier. So it doesn't need to be an excessive amount of glue. Just enough to keep everything steady whilst we stitch. And then we can just nibble our corner exactly the same again. And there we go. And that's our key for our glue on our pocket. We can do then exactly the same to the back of our pocket, and we can rough that up. This is a lot easier because the leather is already a little rougher than the grain side. And then all we need to do is add glue to this, stick together. So what I'm going to do is just rough up these two quickly. So with our leather keyed up in preparation for our glue, we're going to apply glue to those areas. Now the glue that I'm using is House Stick 441 from Abbey, England, here in the UK. However, if you're in the US, it is very similar to Barge. I've tried Barge. It's stinky. And it's a bit of fun when you've been gluing for a day. But it's good stuff. It's also very similar to Evo Stick impact glue. However, you can also use PVA. If this is a little noxious for you, or you're in an environment that isn't well ventilated, see what you can't necessarily see here, unless of course you've watched the workshop tour, which is here on YouTube, is I'm sat right next to a door, so I can ventilate my workshop really easily, and having this sort of glue in the workshop is not an issue. With PVA, you're just going to have to wait a little longer. Another glue, so therefore another, however, there is also latex, also called, like I think, rubber cement. And the latex, and I think you can probably do this with a PVA as well, is you can apply it exactly like I'm doing here to both pieces, let it just go very slightly touch dry and stick them together. Now if your gluing is not great, PVA is fantastic because it does not go off quickly. So if you stick it in the wrong place, you've got the ability to wiggle it around some. Whereas with this contact glue, you absolutely do not. When it's stuck, it's stuck. So your positioning has to be really, really good. So that is down to you now to make your decision. You've got 4 options there to choose from, and you just choose what you feel is best for you. What I will say, PVA is great, but if you're going to make an item that is going to be subject to a high level of moisture, over time that PVA can degrade, and if you're looking at perhaps gluing a lining or a lamination, then PVA might not be the best option. Latex might be better, but certainly my preference is a good strong contact glue. And one of the reasons that I choose this is when it's dry, it remains flexible. That's one of the most important things that I look for in a glue. Using a glue that goes hard, super glue, I've known people do things like this with super glue, but super glue goes hard, and as you flex, it actually will damage the leather. So super glue is definitely not a good choice. So that's touch dry. There's not a lot on there. There doesn't need to be. We are now going to look at positioning this. So we're going to hold it very, very lightly. I'm going to cover those marks, just holding it in the middle, and I'm going to slide it in position, looking at one edge and the bottom. Once I'm happy with the position, I'm going to begin to squish. And I'm going to come to the other side, moving around, and then squish. I'm happy with that. I'm going to pop it down, and I'm going to give it a little rub just to make sure all of it is touching. Do exactly the same to the other one. Lay it over, hold it in the middle, line it up with that edge, line it up with the bottom, get my edges to meet. That's looking good. Come in. Beautiful. Press down, just make sure there's contact with all the edges. We're going to go a step further in a moment, but they're down. I'm now going to take it a step further and use a dome-headed hammer and tap all those edges together. Now, if you use contact glue to do this bit, sometimes it's a good idea to leave those 4 hours before stitching to let the glue cure. Of course, we're not going to do that. We're going to do it straight away because we're impatient. But we have turned our 4 pieces into 2. This is going to make the next stage so much easier. We are now going to commit to our holes. We can bring our pad and our irons back into play. We will also need to catch sight of our template. So this is what we're looking for here. This line here represents the top of our pocket, and above our line we can see 3 holes. So we can go through all the holes that we've created on our pocket, but the truth is we also want to add 3 more above the pocket. Now if we look at this process a little clearer, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm just going to do these a little clearer. There we are, so we can see them a little clearer. I can now move the iron, putting 3 holes above the pocket. But what we're finding is the hole above the pocket is sitting on the pocket. This means the next hole above is 1 full stitch. So we have the maximum amount of leather at the top of this pocket for strength. If this hole is closer, it is weaker. And one of the worst things we can do is cut into the top of that leather. So that game is to be avoided. So I can now settle this on my body, not catching the pocket, and I can commit to making the holes. And I'm going through a good 3mm or so. Again, we don't pull the iron out of the leather, we push the leather off the iron. And we can see that top hole there snugged right at the top of the pocket. That's something that I look for on every card holder I see, and I rarely see it. We can bring the iron to the other side, rinse and repeat. Let's just open these holes up a little so you can see them slightly clearer. Move up 3 holes and we have exactly the same situation, which means we can settle this tool down and that tooth slides past the leather. It doesn't cut into it at all. This is all down to a correctly made template. Same again, punch through, slip off, and at which point then I can continue to make all of my holes exactly the same way. We'll then swap over to our 2-tooth, sticking with our matching pair. Make sure we're going through the same depth. If we are going in deeper with some holes and shallower with others, we end up with a different hole size. If we have large holes, we will have short stitches. If we have shallow holes, or small holes rather, we'll have long stitches. Either is fine. What we don't want is a blend of the two. And that's all of our holes made on one piece. I'm going to do exactly the same to the second. Some of the more astute of you will have noticed I'm using the same iron for both pieces. This means when I put the 2 pieces together, because they're all been made from the same angle, look at that, every single one of those was absolutely beautiful. This means when I put the 2 pieces together, the holes will be different on either side. To all intents and purposes, they will cross. Now, if you have your difficulty, before you start putting comments on it, if you have difficulty getting your head around this concept of the holes crossing, then you need to go and watch the 3 videos on the saddle stitch, because this is not by accident. This is very intentional. I know I'm doing it, Absolutely not. We do not need reverse irons. Yes, we can stitch through and make all our holes from one side, but our stitching will look very slightly different on the back to the front. The object of this game is to make our stitching look identical on both sides, and this is how we achieve it. So there's my two pieces, but when I turn this over, and we can see it a little clearer here, the holes go in opposite directions. That is an absolute intentional act, and we're going to find out why in a moment. So we've glued our pocket to our front twice, so we've turned our 4 pieces into 2. It's now time to stitch those 2 pieces together. Now I've chosen a black thread. The colour of the leather, the colour of the thread is completely unimportant. I've chosen black because it's high contrast and it's going to make it an awful lot easier for you to see the stitching, because that's what ultimately this is about. So I've got my thread with my needles on, and what I want to do now is line up my 2 pieces of leather in preparation for the clam. So I can line up my 2 pieces, and I'm going to take a needle, I'm going to put it through the 3rd hole, and if my holes align, that should just sail through. And then I'm going to go perhaps for the last hole in the straight, and I equally go straight through. That means my holes are aligned, which means my stitching is going to be relatively easy. I'm not going to be fighting it. Get that misalignment, then you're going to be fighting every single stitch. So now we can pop it in the clam. So we can open the clam up, making sure we've got that alignment. What I'm looking for here is these 2 needles both horizontal and parallel to each other, and my edges of my leather line up on all edges. I'm really happy with that. So with everything aligned in the clam, I can take this needle out because the clam has got the leather, and I can center off on that 3rd hole. I've come to the 3rd hole because I want to start with 2 back stitches, and the back stitches are going to be heavier and sit above the pocket. So I'm stitching right-handed, right hand priority, finding the holes relatively easily, and we are away. I'm not going to make you watch me stitch this completely or talk you through it, because if you are interested in stitching in this style, I have up to 5 hours of video on this very topic here on my YouTube channel. So I don't feel I need to go into a massive amount of detail here, because this is the sort of thing that you would approach once you've got your stitching nailed down. If you don't have it nailed down, then realistically you should be practicing your skills and techniques before you're making. There's nothing wrong with learning as you go. There's nothing wrong with learning during a build, as long as you get to a technique on that build and you're not sure about it, you stop, you go away, you learn that technique, you practice it, and then come back to the build and apply it. I can't actually see that hole because that pocket's in the way. There we go. So, throwing in there a cheeky couple of back stitches, making sure that my stitching sits parallel and does not twist, so we can see it in absolutely the best light. And then this is just going to sail straight over this pocket because it is beautifully aligned, and as soon as we tension here we can see that snug in. Look at that. That's what we want to be looking for. If we are not achieving that, then we need to practice that. And getting that bit right all stems from your template. If your attitude is, yeah, I'm not really a template maker, I'll just go with the leather, then you're introducing issues. This video will teach you how to remove those issues and up your leather skills every single time. So I'm going to continue stitching exactly as you see me do here, all the way around until I get to the end. Once at the end, I will apply 2 back stitches to finish. Then we will come to the board and we will look at beveling and dressing this edge once it's finished. And there we go. That is it stitched. So all we're going to do now is just tap down that stitching. This helps to close the holes up. And perhaps deal with any inconsistent tension we may have. We have a look at our edges. There is very little work that needs doing on these edges. It is, to all intents and purposes, the correct size. We are going to give them a very light sand, however. I'm going to do that on the machine just to even it up because it's so much quicker. So we are now back to dressing our leather. Now, on the thin pieces, we used a 0 beveler, taking off a very fine amount. We are working on a thicker piece of leather. We're going to step up to a number 1. This is going to take a little more leather off. We can, if we want to, even go bigger still, and we can move that false edge in towards our stitching a little. Now, what I will say is, whilst we have a skive on here, we can't see it. It looks fat again, but that's because of the sanding. It's lifted these edges. So what we're going to do is we are going to run our number 1 around this, and then we will see it slim down again. And there we go. Spin it around and do the same on the other side. Now when we look at the edge, it looks a little smaller, and it's going to look smaller still once we got our edge coat on. What we did before, we are doing again. Very little, working down our spine, And whilst the fibres are damp, we are going to rub them down, slick them down, making the slicking process that's going to come after easier. Bit by bit. We don't need to do the whole thing at once. We can do little bits. And now I can just focus on this corner, getting it right, slicking those fibres down. Already that edge is looking lovely. I don't need to do anywhere near as much work with the slicking. Now we can sand down our pieces like we've done, and it can look absolutely fine. Sometimes, and here's a good example, we've got a little bit of a divot there. To be fair, we've got rid of that. But sometimes we can do this and we can highlight by edge coating the inconsistencies in our edges. It could be something subtle like a slight undercut. It could be that the time we've taken to make it, the leather has shrunk in a little bit. Sometimes doing something simple like the skiving can soften the leather enough to then want to shrink back. And we can discover that after we put the edge coat on. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing our edge coat to then go back and give it another light sand to even it up. Think of it as a coat of varnish. You wouldn't necessarily just do one coat on a piece of wood. You'd probably do 3. And then coming back up our opposite side. And that is looking rather scrummy. So what I'm looking for now are any light points. So what I'm looking for now are any light points on our bevel. And we've got a couple here. So I'm just going to bring into our bevel. Same again here. Spin it over. Oh, look at that. What have we done, Nige? I've got edge coat on my finger and I put edge coat on the surface of the leather. I'm not going to worry it at the moment. One or two things will happen. It will either come off or it's going to stay there. So I'm going to let this dry. Hopefully it's dry, but again, before we do anything, we're going to get a cloth and we're going to check. Lovely. So now we can apply some tokonol. Exactly the same as we've done before. Again, big finger, big dollop. We probably don't need as much as that. And we're going to just work our way round. And then we're going to spread it until we've got a lovely slick area beneath our fingers. That's what we're feeling for. If we've got any dry spots, then make sure we've got some tokonol in there. That's lovely. We're going to change our slicker from round to flat, and we're going to find a groove that fits, and then we're going to begin to work that edge with our slicker. And we can see already that shine beginning to appear. So we'll go over it lightly first and foremost. Wrong one. And we're bedding in. We've got more layers here. We've got 4, so we may have to go a little firmer. We may find the leather moves because it's had moisture, it's reacted slightly differently, and we have to give it a sand and go over it again afterwards. That's absolutely fine. Doing it once and getting it right is lovely, but sometimes just having that second pass makes all the difference. In the grand scheme of things, I could keep going with that. I could give that a sand, let it dry, give it a sand, and go over it again. But I know full well I'll make that gorgeous and shiny, only to find I come back tomorrow and it goes dull. So I'm better off leaving it for the day and then coming back to it tomorrow and giving it another slick up. But for the video, we're going to call that done. Now, we've got little bits, wrong one, of excessive edge coat. In particular, that one sitting on our front there. So what I'm going to do, with a dry cloth to start with, I'm going to give that a little bit of a rub. See if it comes off. And it's not really coming off, so it's one of those that might be there to stay. So a little bit of mink oil, and we'll try that again. A little more has come off. So I think I'm just going to have to live with that. So what I'm going to do now is get some mink oil. I'm going to go around my edges, because not only may we have a little bit of excess from our edge coat drifting onto the surface, in using the Tokonol, there's the possibility that that's picked up a little bit of edge coat and that's transferred it. So I'm using a little bit of mink oil around the edge as a lubricant for the cloth, because we can actually rub the surface of the leather away. And I'm now going to go round and rub that edge a little more vehemently, cleaning it up. And we see how that just pops. Got a squeaky chair. Don't know if you can hear it, but I can. Spin it over, do exactly the same. That's lifted that edge. That's lifted that edge. That's looking gorgeous. Beautiful. And it just really cuts in. It's almost like applying a bit of teacup to a car. So now we're just going to condition the full surface the same. This leather really doesn't need an awful lot, but standing on the proviso that you cannot hurt it with conditioner, we're just going to give it a little bit of a finish. That'll dry out, its natural colour will come back. Just give the edges a little bit of a smoosh, and we will call that done. One final thing. There may be a residue of glue between the pocket and the body, so we're just going to run a bone folder down and separate any issues we may have. And as it happens, in this instance, because we've been fairly careful with the glue, we don't have any. What I'm going to do next, because that's the thin end of the bone folder, so I'm going to turn it around and use the thick end of the bone folder, and I'm going to lift the pockets out to give it a little bit more of a three-dimensional feel, like so. Now the final thing to do is pop some cards in place. So 2 is the amount that I chose for each pocket. So 2 is what I'm going to pop into each pocket. I'm going to try and line these up so they go in straight, which isn't happening, and square together. Center and squish down. And then my Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. Still waiting on my membership to the Federation of Planets. And then we'll squish down. This first squish always takes a little bit because we're moving the leather. where it doesn't necessarily want to be. There we go. Now, and this is where the magic happens, perhaps get a piece of card underneath. And what we're going to do is rub the leather where the card's sitting. Think of this as dry moulding. So there's no moisture other than a bit of conditioner on the leather, but we are just warming that edge up where the card is sitting, and we can see that it's beginning to pick out. This gives it a lovely three-dimensional feel and view. We'll just go over that stitching again, and that is really making our stitching pop. Turn it over, do exactly the same on the opposite side. See if we can give that another little rub. That's definitely not coming off, so that is there to stay. And there we go. Focus on the stitching. So we've got a lovely simplistic item here, but look at the stitching. This is what you don't see in many other videos. They don't turn stuff over. At the moment, there's no maker's mark on here, so you can't tell me which is the front and which is the back. This is exactly what we're trying to achieve when we're making small leather goods. This is exactly why I have developed this style of stitching using the cross holes, my pre-pricking technique as I call it. And that's how it works. Because the issue that we've always had is when we make the holes the same on the front and the back, our stitching sits opposite our holes and our threads meet, but one thread will sit on top of the other and it will push it down. So if the back thread pushes the front thread down, the front stitch will sit flat. If the front thread pushes the back thread down, the back stitch will sit flat. Yes, there are ways of dealing with this, but ultimately our stitching has always been saying to us, and we've never heard it because we've been stitching with an awl. But since the development of these new irons, where we can independently prick our leather, our stitching is saying, well, I can give you that flat on the back, flat on the front, angled at the back, or I can give you that angled on the front, flat on the back, but I cannot give you that because of this. But if you change how your holes are made, I'll be absolutely fine. And that is what we've done. We've taken this issue away by having our holes crossed, and that has given us a very simplistic and achievable face stitch on both the front and the back. Now, I think you'll agree, that's not a how-to, that's a lesson. People pay money to come to me and spend an entire day to learn how to do this. You've got that. If card holders are on your horizon, then you're set. You've got all the information that you need. If card holders are not on your horizon, then you've got an awful lot of information you can apply to other items, because the skills that we have used to create this are not beginner skills, they're not card holder specific, they are the fundamental core skills that we use on everything that we make. So irrelevant of the objects that we've worked on, we have had a good demonstration on our measuring, on our template making, on our cutting, on our stitching, on our creasing, on our dressing. All of these things have come together. If you've got any questions, I'm an email away, nigel@armitageleather.com. If you want to take this a step further, what you see me deliver here is exactly the same content that is delivered on the channel, except all the stuff behind me is a lesson. And there's a whole bunch of lessons on there. So if you're really looking at upping your game, upping your leather skills, go and join secretsfromtheworkshop.com. If you want to come and see me in person, go to armitageleather.com and book a lesson with me, or book on one of the group courses. It's entirely up to you. As and when, I will stick more on YouTube. I've not given YouTube the love that perhaps it deserves. So it's about time that I spent a little bit more time dedicating stuff to YouTube. So the more you tell me you like it by subscribing, the more stuff I will add. But until then, take care. I hope you've taken something from this. But more importantly, I hope you achieve with it and it helps. Have a good day, and I'll speak to you soon.